In my previous lecture on slide preparation, I talked to you about certain issues that can make your slides good and effective. Today I am going to talk to you about some more issues such as fonts, color, background, the use of proper spelling and proofreading before you submit your presentations or do a final presentation. So let's begin with the fonts. Fonts are often used by all of us, but we do not know for what reason we use a particular font. Now, what is the reason why we need to talk about these fonts? When we use a particular font or a typeface, it is because of visibility and the readability factor. If people are not able to see your fonts, they are not able to read, identify the fonts that you've used, or you're making reading difficult for them, then using them in a PowerPoint presentation can become a useless or a disadvantageous factor. Now, use your fonts depending on the size of your audience. As I said before, visual aids, when you use visual aids, you have to keep in mind the kind of audience that you have. Alright. So, here I reiterate this point. If you have audiences who are children, then you have to customize your font accordingly so that you make it interesting for them to watch your presentation. If you are doing a professional presentation in your organization, or you are doing a classroom presentation, then you need to remember that your audience can be students or your colleagues or your seniors who are working with you in your office, and accordingly you have to design or pick up fonts for that purpose. The font size that you use should match the tone and message of your presentation. Sometimes you use large fonts, sometimes you use smaller fonts. Now, when do you use larger fonts? When do you use small fonts? It all depends on the kind of audience that you have and the size of the audience that you have. If you have a large audience sitting until till the last row, what you need to do then is use larger fonts, because it has to be visible. Your writing or your bullet points have to be visible to the person sitting in the last row. If you have a closed meeting with people who are sitting near you, then you need not use fonts that are large enough. Generally, we use a standard of 24 points in the text box and maybe 34 or 30 depending on the space provided and the title, length of the title in the title box. Otherwise, the text font is generally 24. Maybe it can be varied between 24 to 28 if necessary. If you follow the 6 by 7 rule, then it has a standard of maybe 24 to 28 point size. Select a single sans serif font such as Arial, Helvetica or Lucida Console, as you can see in my slide, and avoid serif fonts like Times New Roman or Palatino for the simple reason that they have designs in the corners which makes reading difficult. Now, look at what bad fonts can be like. If you have too small fonts, your audience will not be able to read what you've written. Never ever capitalize your bullet points, because it makes reading very difficult and tedious for your audience. Don't use complicated fonts either, because the example that I have given here makes the font so close that reading from a distance can become confusing. The alphabets may overlap and therefore make reading difficult for your audience. So, try to avoid these fonts. Moving on to the color aspect of our slides. Most of us like to make our presentations very effective, and therefore we resort to using colorful backgrounds or colorful fonts. That may be okay if you are addressing children, because that is what captivates them. But in a professional or a classroom presentation, the kind of colors or the preparation that you make for your slides needs to be formal, and therefore you should use colors very judiciously. Use a color of font that contrasts sharply with your background. Example, blue font on a white background, or maybe black on a white background. Use color to reinforce the logic of your structure. If you want to say something specifically and you want to draw the audience's attention to the particular word or an idea, feel free to use color, as I have done before, but use it only to emphasize a point. Look at my example here, where I have used the word occasionally in a color, which is different from the rest of my bullet points. Before I move on, I would like to tell you that the general assumption is that in a classroom presentation, we generally use white or light backgrounds with dark fonts like black or blue. And in professional or official or business presentations, the normal understanding is that we use a black or a blue background with light fonts such as white or off-white. Now look at this slide, where I have used examples to show you how bad coloring can make your slide or your bullet points ineffective and unimpressive. The first one is in a yellow color that merges with the background, my white background, alright, and therefore the fonts are not clear. My audience has to strain to find out what I have written in my slide. Look at the next one. I have used too many words with different colors. Look at my third example. I use a different color for each point, which is unnecessary. Alright. Look at my last example. I have used a whole lot of colors to make it creative, but then that is not the point. A formal presentation needs to drive home the idea and not divert your attention to other creative aspects of your presentation. Rather, it should focus on the idea or the point that you want to make to your audience. Let's move on to the background. What do I mean by background? I am talking about the background in which my fonts or my bullet points are drafted. Look at my first point. Use backgrounds such as this one that are attractive but simple. I have used a white background. You could use a lighter background with a dark font. I have used black color here to contrast with the gray scale and make my fonts, project my font so that reading becomes easier for my audience. Use backgrounds which are light. As you can see, I have already done that. Use the same background consistently in all your slides for uniformity. Variety in the backgrounds is not permissible if you are doing a formal presentation. It doesn't go with the kind of presentation that you are doing. Look at this background. It seems very colorful, very attractive, but can you see none of my fonts are visible because of the color or background that I have used. Now this is a very bad kind of background that I have used and something that you should never ever use in your slides. However interesting or impressive they may be. Sometimes we use sounds or animation also to make our presentations impressive. But be careful about these because they need to be used at the right time and properly, without which they lose their importance. Having spoken to you about fonts and about the backgrounds, I'd like to now move on to another thing that we use in our slides, and that's about graphs. Pictures can be used. Graphs are also kinds of pictures that you can use and which are very effective in letting your audience know about certain data or statistics that you're talking about. Instead of using numbers all the time, you can always use graphs, pictorials to impress your audience with the statistics or data that you're talking about. Whenever you use a graph, remember to use all the parameters appropriately, name them appropriately, number them if necessary, and also don't forget to give a title to your slide. Without a title, your graph or your picture is meaningless. It doesn't relate to your audience. Look at this example of a bad slide. We have all the details that are put up there. We have 4 months that are mentioned. We are talking about blue balls and red balls, some statistics regarding these things in the month of January, February, March, April. But what? What about the months? What about the data? What about these balls? Do you understand what we are actually talking about? No, but I have a whole lot of data. Now look at my next slide, which looks much more impressive. I have here with me a graph which has 2 bars. I have the indicative box there where I have used blue for the blue balls, red box indicating red balls, and therefore I have all the details like the months and also the other numericals that I have on the other axis. Both the x and the y axis are sufficiently informative and therefore leave no space for ambiguity or confusion. I think you will understand what I mean by using a good graph. Also, you will notice that my graph has a relevant title, making it clear as to what my data or statistics is all about. Look at another bad graph that I would like to show you. The problem, what do you think the problem with this graph be? There are colors, there are data, there are a whole lot of things put there, and yet the title is missing. The font is too small to be read. There are too many grid lines. The colors are not very clear and therefore overlapping, and therefore the purpose of using this graph is a waste. Having talked to you about good fonts, backgrounds, and about use of graphs or pictorials, I would now like to move on to another important aspect. Your presentation is almost ready with everything that you've used, but yet not ready because you haven't proofread it. Make sure that you read your slides for spelling errors and grammatical errors. Errors of this kind should be avoided if you want to have a faultless or a good presentation. Now, read your slides to see if you have any spelling mistakes. See if you have used words repeatedly, correct them, see if you can bring in other words. Avoid grammatical errors, make the corrections wherever necessary, delete wherever there are too many words, avoid wordiness, remove prepositions or articles wherever necessary. Begin your bullet points with verbs because it makes it easier to follow the 6/7 rule when you begin your bullet point with verbs. Alright? If English is not your first language, please remember to ask somebody who is fluent with the language to go through your slides and make the necessary corrections.